Study 4, Forming the Nation of Israel.
Well, as we enter our fourth session in our study of understanding the Old Testament, we find ourselves in the first period of Old Testament history, the period of formation. And this is the period which is the longest of the four periods, and it's the time when God has been forming the nation of Israel. The launching pad for 700 plus years of Israel's history is Genesis 12:2, where God states that I am going to make of you, Abraham, a great nation. And so the storyline now is involved with how this is going to take place. The first aspect, you got to have people, don't you, to have a nation. And so we've been laboring through this whole business of people, or more correctly, the lack thereof. And so as we've looked at this, and we're looking at the forming of the nation, we have people, law, and land. We're still in the people aspect. If we could back up just a half a step or so and take, by way of review, we saw that Abraham made a covenant with God. God made a covenant with him when Abraham was about 50 years old. As we move through the covenant, which was initially given in chapter 12, we find that in chapter 15, he makes this covenant legally binding. But the amazing thing was that Abraham has matured now to be 100 years old, actually 99, when God then informs him, I've been telling you the truth the whole time. You and Sarah are going to have a boy, and that will be the covenant son. You're going to call his name Isaac. And sure enough, 1 year after Abraham was told that, and he and Sarah, we can understand, had a little bit of disbelief that this is going to happen. I mean, when's the last time you heard a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man having a baby? Probably not in any of our experience. So this is quite unusual, but that's why the New Testament says that Abraham believed God, that God was the giver of life. And while it made no sense, in a sense, that this would happen, God gave them a son, Isaac. Now Isaac, when he was 40 years old, got married. Married actually an individual off the family tree by the name of Rebekah. True to form, they had no child. They've been married 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and still no child is born. You know, making a nation is apparently more difficult than we thought it was. But they came to the Lord, and at age 60, Isaac prayed, and God told them that they would have, in fact, not one son, but two. They were going to have twins. And the wrinkle in all of that was that the one that is born first, who would be called Esau, would not be the covenant son. It would be the second born. And so we saw that Jacob, who will have his name changed to Israel, was now going to be the covenant son. Esau is a part of the program, but God has his own purposes for Esau. Jacob is the man. And Jacob, through some hostilities with his brother, flees to a place called Haran, and there he will get 4 wives and 11 sons are born in the 20-year period. He will have a 12th son, but that son will be born back in the land after he returns from Haran. So when this part of the story is over, he goes back to Canaan. And so far, the story in Genesis has been Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now the story is going to focus on the firstborn of the favorite wife, the firstborn was Joseph. And so when we take a look at the family tree of Abraham, you can see that Abraham has had, actually, when the dust settles, 8 sons. When the dust settles, Abraham has 8 sons. When Sarah dies, he marries again Keturah and has 6 sons. These sons will be form other nations. For he has a son, for example, by the name of Midian. And the Midianites are found several places in the Old Testament. Ishmael, of course, was not the covenant son, but you can see he goes down through Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons. But the focus of attention now is on Joseph, who is in fact the 11th born son of the favorite wife, Rachel. So we now turn to the story of Joseph, but you can see what's happened now. The nation, which has been really quite small, has been, the building blocks for the nation have now been set in place. The 12 sons of Jacob will now become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, which find their place throughout the Old Testament and even in the last book of Revelation. There are the 12 sons of Jacob there. So when we go back to the formation of the nation, we come now to the man Joseph. I think that for most of you, the story of Joseph is familiar. If it is not, you gotta read it. Get to Genesis chapter 39 and read those next 11 chapters. It is something that is an amazing story, the twists and the turns. We can only highlight it. I would like to go into it, but we don't have that kind of time. Joseph was the favorite of his father Jacob. Now you would have thought that after his own experience of playing favorites by his parents, that he would have learned that it wasn't a very good idea. But Jacob unashamedly made it clear, Joseph, son of his favorite wife Rachel, was in fact his favorite. And we remember the story that he made him a festive robe, a very unique garment that set him apart. Nobody else had this. It's kind of like if he was given a sweatshirt saying, "I'm number one." And Joseph would wear that around, like, in your face, brothers. You see, I am number one. And so Joseph, what he lacked in wisdom, he made up with arrogance. The story then focuses on when he was 17 years old. And Joseph was constantly kind of rubbing it in to his brothers. His brothers didn't like him at all. In fact, the day came when they are out far, far away from dear old Dad and the family unit, where they're watching the herds. Joseph comes out. Dad sends him to check up on his brothers. Well, that doesn't fly real well with his brothers. And they see him coming and they say, "Hey, here he comes." And he's wearing his "I'm number one" sweatshirt in the process. And they say, "What are we going to do? This guy drives us crazy. Let's kill him." Kill your brother? Several of them thought that was a great idea. That's one way to eliminate the problem. But they said, "Hey, he's our brother. We can't do that. Let's sell him as a slave." And sure enough, as luck would have it, some Midianite traders, part of the family unit, actually a descendant of Abraham, come through the area where they are watching their flocks, and they sell Joseph. Probably put handcuffs on him, and he's sold. And they kill an animal. They rip off his "I'm number one" sweatshirt, sprinkle blood all over it, and take it to dear old Dad and say, "Look what we found out in the countryside. It looks familiar." And Jacob recognizes that's what I made for my son Joseph. And so he was convinced that Joseph is now dead. Well, Joseph goes down into Egypt at age 17, And Joseph recognizes that he's in deep trouble. But this is a needed process. This guy is really an arrogant kid. And so he is sold, put on an auction block and sold. And he happens to be bought by a high-ranking political figure by the name of Potiphar, who was way, way up in the court of Pharaoh. So Joseph is purchased, and Joseph was a smart guy, good-looking guy. He had it all, and he knew it, by the way. But he was then a part of the servants of Potiphar. Well, he rose in the ranks because he was skilled at what he did. He apparently did a good job. And while he is there, Potiphar's wife, who has a lot of free time on her hand, been watching too many episodes of Desperate Egyptian Housewives, and she begins to make a play for Joseph. She wants to have an affair. And Joseph says, no, I can't do that. I can't betray Potiphar, but I can't betray my God. Well, this girl is tenacious. She keeps going after him. And one day, she catches him alone in the house. And Joseph, she's coming after him. And so he fakes right, cuts left, and gets out of there as fast as they can. But she grabs his coat, the outer garment, and rips it off. And when hubby comes home, she is ticked that this slave would reject her. I mean, after all, she was a prize. Look what I have. That slave of yours, he made a move on me. And I screamed, but nobody was around. And look, he left his garment and I got it. Well, Potiphar, I think, I'm reading between the lines here, I don't think he believed her. But what are you going to do? He doesn't kill Joseph. He rather puts him in prison. And Joseph spends 4 years in jail. That's not fair. But you got to understand, God was refining this young man. Well, he has been given by God the ability to interpret dreams. And without going into the details of it all, one night, Pharaoh himself, the man, has a couple of dreams. And they're more like nightmares. He is really upset by them, really disturbed by them. And so one of his servants, whose dreams had been interpreted perfectly, 100% accuracy by Joseph, when in prison, said, hey, there is a guy, a Hebrew who's in jail, who can do this. Pharaoh brings him in, cleans him up a little bit, puts on fresh garments, brings him in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, this is my dream. And he tells a couple of dreams that he had. And Joseph says, it's very clear what this means. He said he had a dream of fat cows, big fat cows, and then 7 real skinny cows come. And the skinny little cows ate the fat cows, and they remained skinny. Go figure on that one. But at any rate, Joseph says it's very clear what this is. This is the fact that Egypt is going to have a time of great prosperity. 7 years where you're going to have bumper crops on top of bumper crops. I mean, it's going to be amazing. But equally as bad, there's going to be then, that will be followed by 7 years of intense famine. Crop failures, it's going to be a disaster. And so Joseph, after he interprets the dream, says to Pharaoh, look, my advice to you, if you want it, is you get somebody who can handle the bumper crops and store up grain and then be prepared for the 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh thinks about this, says, you know what? You're the man. Anybody who can do this, you're the guy. And so here he is. When he gets up in the morning, he's a jailbird, spending 4 years. When he goes to bed at night, he is now number 2 man in the Egyptian empire because Pharaoh has said, you are going to be the greatest man, aside from me, in all of Egypt. Now you talk about God when he wants to bring about something. He has better plans. He goes from a prisoner to a prime minister in less than 24 hours. Well, this is great. And exactly what Joseph said did happen. 7 years go by of great plenty, 7 years of great famine that not only affected Egypt, but its tentacles went into the land of Canaan as well. Well, what happened was his brothers, his family, lives in Canaan, and the famine begins to hit there. 2 years into the famine, old Jacob, the patriarch, says, "What are you guys doing sitting around looking at one another? We're going to starve here unless you guys get down to Egypt and buy some grain." So 10 of the brothers go down to Egypt, and Joseph sees them. Now remember, he's 17 when they sold him. 22 years have passed. He is now 39 years old. Most of us realize that when you're 17 and 39, you look a little bit different. But beyond that, he's now dressed as an Egyptian. He speaks as an Egyptian. And his brothers, when they came down there to buy grain, had to deal with this rather austere Egyptian, not realizing that's their brother. Well, the story is intricate. It is so wonderfully woven together. The brothers come down. He recognizes them, and he says to them, "You guys are spies. I've seen spies before. You guys are spies." "Oh, no, mister. We aren't spies. We're just hungry. Well, we're actually, there are 10 of us. Actually, there's one other brother back in the land, and, well, we had another brother, but he's kind of off the scene now." Said, "Well, do you have a father? Is he alive?" "Yep, he's alive." "Well, what's that other brother of yours?" "Well, he's the youngest and the favorite." "Well, I tell you what, you guys, I'll give you some grain, but don't you dare come back to Egypt for more grain unless you bring that brother." You see, that was Benjamin was Joseph's full brother. He wants to see his brother. So some time goes by, you eat up the grain after a while, and finally they have to come back, and Jacob is beside himself. "What did you tell the guy that you had a brother for?" Because he loves Benjamin. He lost Joseph. Well, we might as well not go down there. Without Benjamin, he's not going to give us anything. So Benjamin comes down, and Joseph is so touched. He sees his brother. And so he says to his servants, "We're going to have a meal for these guys. And I want you to put them in this order." And he gives them on the table setting the birth order of these 11 sons. They go in to have a meal. They're scared. I mean, they don't know what this guy is going to do. Life and death is in his hands. But they go in and they look at the table, say, "This is uncanny. We are being placed in birth order." And they know, and they're shut off from everybody else, or it's a private dining room. And they think, "Uh-oh, I think we're being set up." And Joseph views them. And then I wish we had the video cameras working at that time, because I would focus on Joseph's brother when he gets up and he says to them, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold." And you can just see their faces. 11 faces drop, because in their opinion, they're not going to see the next sunrise. He's going to take them out, and vengeance is so sweet. But he says, "Look, I know you guys did it for the wrong reasons, but God sent me down here to preserve our family. And here's what's going to happen. You go back home, tell dear old Dad I'm alive, and don't you know that would have been a task to explain to Dad, we set you up, Dad. He was never killed at all. But you bring the family down here," and that's exactly what took place. It's interesting to me, when the brothers respond, they say, and this is 25 years after they're selling Joseph, they're laden with guilt. The first thing they say is, "This is because we did this to our brother, that this guy is going to harass us and put us to death, maybe." They're unconnected, but that's what guilt does. They were clearly understanding. They lived with that all of their lives, and Joseph forgave them. The power of forgiveness, and they were liberated from that. And what a scene! I wish we had that on tape, that we could see it. But what a scene it was! The reason why God did this and why God sent Joseph down using the wrong motives of the brothers was that he wanted to protect his nation. Now, you know what happens when a little baby is born into this world? Oftentimes, what do we do with newborns? They go in an incubator, they go in a nursery, they're taken care of, they're put in a special environment for their protection. Well, Egypt is now going to become the incubator for the little baby nation. The nation of Israel, by this time, has grown to a whopping 75 people. I mean, after several centuries, we're making progress at least. You got to admit that. So God takes his nation out of Canaan and brings them down into Egypt. Egypt, unknowingly, with its powerful army, is now going to be the protector of Israel. And they're going to protect them in three ways. First of all, they're going to protect Israel physically. And why would that happen? Well, first of all, back in Canaan, you have these marauding groups, and frankly, 75 people could be eliminated, between lunch and the afternoon coffee break. They were very vulnerable there. But now you have one of the most powerful militaries in the world now actually protecting them. Because Pharaoh said, bring them on down and we're going to give them a great land to live in. So they offered the physical protection. Secondly, they would be protected racially. God wanted Israel to remain racially distinct. And so they, down in Egypt, the likelihood of them doing a lot of intermarriage was not great. Why? Well, because the Israelites were fundamentally shepherds, and shepherds were looked down upon by the Egyptians. They were kind of like in a caste system, if you wish. The shepherds would be way down, and no self-respecting Egyptian man is going to want to marry an Israelite woman, and probably you would have this sort of a prohibition of this within Israel as well. The third thing that being down in Egypt protected the nation for was in the area of morality and spirituality. They lived in Canaan, and the Canaanite culture was a triple X-rated society. The gods of Canaan, Baal, Ashtaroth, and those were fertility gods and goddesses. And the Canaanites were about as immoral as a race of people could be. And God knew that if his people stayed in the land, they're eventually going to be integrated into these fertility cults, and this is going to do great harm. The Egyptians were polytheistic. They had gods all over the place, but they were different than the Canaanites. And so bringing them down to Egypt was a good thing. Israel, the little baby nation, is put in the incubator called Egypt. And now they will grow down there. Now, let's move on to the next foundational book of Exodus. The book of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph, and the book of Exodus begins with the birth of Moses. Joseph died around the year 1800 BC. And Moses was born about 1525 BC. And even if you're not a whiz at math, you can look at that and realize that between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus is a period of 275 years, almost 3 centuries. And there's no history. We don't know what's going on except the summary statement in the book of Exodus, and in chapter 1, it summarizes the 275-year period in this way. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. And the word that's used there is a swarm, like a swarm of insects. They are all over the place in Israel. And so when Genesis closes, we are told that in the text of Genesis that the nation is about 75. When Exodus opens, we learn that the nation is now conservatively 2.5 million. We know this because the first census that would be taken down at Mount Sinai numbers the people in such a way that we understand what the total nation size will be, and we'll take a look at that. So what's happened? Hooray! Finally, we have people. This has been a long, laborious process of making a nation, but now we have the law code that's necessary. And so in the meantime, with all of these people being born, a new Pharaoh is very nervous, and he's concerned that he's going to have a group within his nation of foreigners, that if they are attacked from the outside, these people will rise up internally against Egypt. And so what he did was he began to enslave the people and took some steps to try to eliminate the birth rate within the nation of Israel. During that period of time, a man by the name of Moses was born. And he, of course, is going to be the key guy in bringing about the law code, the Constitution, and will lead them to the very doors of the Promised Land, which is then the third element of a nation. So let's take a look at this as we continue on with period number 1. Moses lived for 120 years. This is an amazing thing. I had cataract surgery done not long ago, but at 120, Moses' eyes were not dim. It's an amazing thing. I'm not sure I want to live to be 120, but Moses did. And very nicely, very conveniently, Moses divided his life up into 3 equal parts. I thought that was very thoughtful of him for future studies, of 40, 40, and 40. Now, initially, we have the birth of Moses about 1525. And during the first 40 years of his life, he was in the Egyptian royalty. He had been adopted because of some unusual circumstances by the daughter of Pharaoh, and so he's raised with the privilege of being in royalty. Everything a kid wanted, probably he had Xboxes and whatever else that kids wanted in that day, but he would have them. The choicest experiences and opportunities. And we learn, as we listen very carefully, that he apparently was a part of the military. He probably was sort of maybe a general in their army. And he lived a life of privilege. Well, when he was 40 years old, as both Old and New Testament testify, Moses killed an Egyptian. And all of a sudden, Pharaoh, who apparently wasn't particularly attached to Moses, wanted posters go up all over the post office in Egypt, wanted for murder Moses. Moses realized that probably it was time to leave Egypt, and that's what he did. He flees the land, and he goes down to the land of Midian, and now he becomes a shepherd for 40 years. You talk about a change in occupation from a general perhaps in the Egyptian army to a shepherd out in some backwater area where nobody particularly lives. But while he's there, he meets a nice girl and gets married. And he's happily, I guess, living his life down there when you have that interesting moment in time where near a place called Sinai, he comes across a burning bush. The bush is blazing away, but it doesn't get burned up. Now, look, when you're out in the desert with nothing else to do, a bush that is burning and never burns up, hey, you might as well go investigate that, right? So he does, and God says to him, my people are enslaved in Egypt and they need to be rescued. Moses thinks, that's a great idea. And God says, you're the man. Moses did not think that was a great idea. But as the Lord persuaded him, Moses will now become the deliverer. I mean, if there's anybody who knows the inside workings of royalty and of government, it's Moses. He spent 40 years there. And so he, in fact, is now sent back to Egypt, and there he is in the year 1445, and we'll be able to validate this in a later study. Very specifically, we have the dates on which Old Testament chronology is built. So this is not just wishful thinking or a shot in the dark. This would be very close to within a year or so of the Exodus of 1445. And then, of course, Moses will spend the last years of his life in leading the people, unfortunately, around the wilderness until he will die in the year 1405 when he hands off the leadership baton. When you look at, come to the book of Exodus, there's three verses that you need to be aware of. First of all, way back in Genesis 15, where God, remember, made the ratification covenant with Abraham, he also told Abraham, your descendants are going to be enslaved in a foreign land for hundreds of years. So in other words, the slavery business down in Egypt did not catch God off guard. The second one is found in later on in the book of Genesis, where the exact number of the nation is given that came down into Egypt. And then, more interesting than all, is the part of Stephen's sermon in the New Testament, where he reflects back on the history of Israel. And what he does is that he talks about Moses, and he tells us stuff that we don't find in Exodus. As an example, God said to Moses, I want you to represent me to Pharaoh and deliver my people. Moses says, it's not going to happen. I can't speak. I'm tongue-tied. I just can't talk. You expect me to go and be some orator before Pharaoh. Well, what Acts 7 says that Moses was mighty in word and deed. In other words, he's lying through his teeth down there at the burning bush. He was very capable in every way. So that is a particular passage that's of interest because it sheds light. It's back on this event. It's what I call a divine commentary, that God later on tells us information about a previous event. Well, going back to the situation in Egypt, after Israel is growing and Pharaoh decides to try to remove the growth process by eliminating, God raises up Moses, and he is going to bring about deliverance through these plagues. Now, several facts about the plagues without going into any great detail about them. The plagues themselves, probably took 8 or 9 months. That's a guess. But it wasn't in one long weekend that all of this happened. And the plagues were designed to really go after the gods of Egypt. The great issue was, who is the greatest god? And the Egyptians had a god. They had a frog god. They had gods of the cattle and everything else. And so when these things target these various things like cattle and frogs and so on, it was designed to let the Egyptians know that when it comes to gods, the great God is the Lord Jehovah. So these plagues, God used normal things. People knew about frogs, but it has to do with the intensity of them, so that there were billions of frogs all over the land. And they were in places like your bed and in your oven and things like that. So if you walked to the store, you'd go crunch, crunch, crunch on frog bodies all the way. It was a mess. And the plagues did this kind of thing until Pharaoh said, okay, I get the point, you can leave. But then he kept going back on his promises. So the thing about them, though, is that they were predicted ahead of time by Moses. Moses didn't say, hey, oh, by the way, you know about those frogs last week? That was God. No, he said ahead of time, there are frogs coming. Frogs like you've never seen before. And sure enough, a day or two later, here come the frogs. Secondly, they were intense. They had never seen anything like this before, the intensification. And secondly, they discriminated between Israel and the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians suffered these plagues and God kept His people safe from them. The first 9 plagues hammered the economy of Egypt. And, Pharaoh's counselors said to him, let them go. Do you not realize what's happening to our economy? I mean, we are being trashed by these things. Pharaoh said, okay, I'll let him go. And then he once again went back on his word. And so God brought along the final plague, which is the death of the firstborn. And the Israelites were not automatically eliminated from this particular plague. They had to take certain precautions. And the idea was that they had to take a lamb in the prime of life. That was the most expensive and valuable type of an animal. It could have no defect. They had to look at it for a period of 7 days, make sure no blemishes, didn't have an ear half torn off or something. It had to be killed. In other words, getting a nice lamb around your house wasn't going to solve the problem. The lamb had to be killed, and then its blood applied on the doorpost of the house. And why? I mean, that just seems, can't we just get out of Egypt? Why do we have to do this? Well, as you may be aware, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul refers to Jesus as the Passover lamb. And that's where the connect was. And all these things that were true of a lamb were also true of the God-man Jesus. He was perfect. He was a male in the prime of life. He died on the cross, and by doing so, shed his blood. But the idea was that, if you killed a lamb and you didn't apply the blood, it was kind of useless. And that's the idea in this incredible picture of the salvation that God offers. The blood was shed. It's a historical fact that took place. And I would point out, Jesus died, but He rose from the dead. And what I tell my students is this: you have doubts about your Christian faith. I understand that happens. But you go back to one thing, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. If He did not rise from the dead, then all this is nonsense. You might as well sleep in on Sunday mornings. But if He did, then all of His claims and everything that the Bible talks about is true. And so I say to people who say, well, I don't know if this is all true or not. Okay, that's your call. But have you studied the issue historically of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead? If you haven't done that, you're cheating yourself, because the blood has to be applied, and the picture is that we receive the gift that God is offering. So, the Passover, in fact, does break Pharaoh. Israel flees across the Red Sea and on dry ground, and this is where, of course, the Egyptian army goes in after them. That's the famous story, and if nothing else, check out Charlton Heston's version from many years ago. By the way, they didn't quite have that right. If you remember that old film, the way the water is kind of right here, you can almost reach out and touch it. No. There was probably at least a 3-mile stretch of dry ground, because you had to get 2.5 to 3 million people across in less than 8 hours. And you're not doing it single file with a lot of cows and sheep following after you. So they get over on the other side, and they leave Goshen, and they come down to cross the Red Sea. And then there are 4 different places that the text talks about. And so that is the traditional route of the Exodus. There are some problems with that, actually. Now, there's a monastery that's been built down there which attracts tourists. So they're going to fight an alternate idea to the Exodus, but there is an alternate idea, and that is that the people, these 4 places, but that the people actually went this way and crossed over this arm of the Gulf of Aqaba, and that the Mount Sinai is actually located in modern-day Saudi Arabia. There's some growing evidence that that's probably the case. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference because they're eventually all going to end up here at Kadesh Barnea anyway. But this does raise a bit of a question, and the question is, was something wrong with Moses' GPS? I mean, why in the world, if you're going to Canaan, why in the world do you go that direction? I mean, boom, that's the way to go, man. Do you realize how many days you cut off of travel? Well, there is actually an answer to that. Israel went to Canaan by way of Mount Sinai for 2 reasons, which are explained. Number 1, God had told Moses, I want you to bring the people back here where the burning bush was, and this will be a place where they can learn about me, because remember, they've been in polytheistic culture for, years now. They can learn about me, and they can worship me, and we can kind of get acquainted. The second thing was that you go through that other route, you're going through the territory of the Philistines, and the Philistines are the bad boys in the neighborhood. All they like to do is fight and kill, and they're bloodthirsty people, and God recognizes they're not ready to fight. I mean, these people have been building houses and farming land all of these years. So they went down to Mount Sinai. They're going to spend about a year down there, and 3 things are going to take place down at Mount Sinai. Most notable is that you're going to have the giving of the law code. Again, that's not just the 10 Commandments. It rather is the entire law code, which covered every area of life, really, over 600 laws. The second thing that would take place is that they are going to build a portable worship center known as the Tabernacle. And that will be the place where God will meet with His people until that day, some 500 years later, when Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, on Mount Zion or Mount Moriah, will build the temple. But until that time, they're going to have a portable worship center, which when Joshua goes into the land, he will put it in a place called Shiloh. The third thing that's going to happen is that the nation is going to get organized. And God sets up, it's an incredible thing to read portions of Numbers and Leviticus, the intricacy of God's setup as far as the nation. God is very interested in detail, and there's quite an organization there as well. And so that's what they're going to be doing for about 1 year, down at Mount Sinai. And they're going to be receiving their law code. So as we draw to a close, we now have people and we have law. We still need to get land. We do want to say a few things about the law, and that's in fact what we'll be doing in our next study together.